Hello everybody, welcome to Deeksha Online. So let us continue with the lecture that we were discussing about. We were discussing about the chapter Reproduction in Organisms. Now, as usual, to give you an idea about the chapter overview or the roadmap, we have already discussed about asexual reproduction. We had started discussing about the process of sexual reproduction, the sexual reproductive phases in the life of an organism when it comes to plants, and the phases when it comes to animals, isn't it? Then we have to discuss some of the important features of sexual reproduction, that is pre-fertilization events, which is gametogenesis and gamete transfer, fertilization, that is the process of formation of zygote, and after that what happens to the zygote, which is under the post-fertilization events, that is the zygote, which is a single cell, undergoes embryogenesis in order to form a multicellular embryo. So this gives you an idea of what to look forward to in this lecture. Now a quick review of what we have done in the previous lecture. In the previous lecture, we have discussed about the sexual reproduction in animals, the phases. If you remember, we had used the word juvenile phase. For plants, we had used the word vegetative phase. For animals, we used the word juvenile phase, isn't it? So juvenile, reproductive, and senescent phase. Then we had distinguished between two types of animals, that is those that breed or that reproduce, or those that are reproductively active during only a particular season in their reproductive phase, and those that are reproductively active throughout. So seasonal versus continuous breeders. Then in both these animals we had learnt certain cyclical changes that are associated with the female reproductive system, which is the menstrual cycle, which happens in continuous breeders, and estrous cycle, which happens in seasonal breeders. We had discussed about the events of sexual reproduction. In that we started off with how does an organism prepare for reproduction, that is pre-fertilization events. In that we had learned the process of gamete formation, sexuality of plants and animals, and gamete formation, how is it formed, either by mitosis or by meiosis, depends on the ploidy or the chromosome number of the parent organism. And then we had seen how the gametes get transferred. In lower plants, the gametes are motile. When the gametes or the male gametes are non-motile, we saw that it is transferred through pollen tube, that is through a process referred to as pollination in seed plants. And in animals also, there needs to be certain adaptations like presence of copulatory organs to transfer the gametes into the female body, isn't it? So especially in animals which exhibit internal fertilization. So getting into the details of the remaining aspect in this particular chapter is the major and the most important the most critical event in the process of sexual reproduction. In the previous lecture, we saw how the organism prepares for fertilization, that is pre-fertilization events. So in this particular lecture, we are going to learn about what fertilization is all about. Another word, a term that is used interchangeably with fertilization is called syngamy. Okay, so you can either call it as fertilization or you can call it as syngamy. All right. Now, how do you define fertilization? A very important definition question again. Fertilization can be defined as the fusion of the male and the female gametes. So by now you all are aware the cells which participate in fertilization are referred to as the sex cells or the gametes, isn't it? Now gametes are haploid, they have only one set of chromosomes in them. So the male and the female gamete come together, they fuse together, and this process is called fertilization or syngamy. And what is the outcome of fertilization? The outcome is the formation of a diploid zygote, isn't it? So there is a formation of a single cell which now has two sets of chromosomes, one set derived from the male gamete and one set derived from the female gamete. Okay, so here you can see a diagrammatic depiction. So this is the female gamete, or the egg, and this is the male gamete, and you can see how both the female and the male gamete are fusing together to result in the formation of a single cell, and this single cell is now referred to as the zygote, and zygote has two sets of chromosomes in it. Okay. Now, there are certain cases where an organism does not participate in fertilization at all. That's why we use the word evades syngamy. So, there are cases where there is evasion, there is escaping fertilization. How is this possible? This is possible through a process referred to as parthenogenesis. Again, a very important definition, plus they may ask you examples as well. So definition plus example question, parthenogenesis. Now mostly in parthenogenesis, it is the female gamete or the egg which is participating here. There is no contribution by the sperm. So what happens in parthenogenesis is the egg or the female gamete begins to undergo development into a new organism even without fertilization. See, fertilization is not required. There is no requirement of the sperm. Did you understand? Now, generally in fertilization, what happens? The egg and the sperm fuse together. But here there is no requirement of the sperm at all. The egg on its own will start undergoing development to give rise to offspring, to give rise to young ones. So this process where the female gamete, listen carefully to the explanation, the definition, the female gamete that undergoes development to form young ones or new organisms without fertilization. So you have to importantly use this word in your definition, that it is without fertilization that the egg develops into a zygote, or the egg develops into a young one or new organisms. Okay, there are some examples. There are invertebrates like rotifers which exhibit parthenogenesis, and then there are insects like honeybees, and even there are advanced vertebrates like birds which include turkey, and there are some of the lizards which are known to reproduce by parthenogenesis. Now, one thing you must be able to remember here is there is absolutely no contribution of the male sex in parthenogenesis. So, imagine there is a group of lizards where all of them are females. So, that also shouldn't matter, because the female is producing an egg and the egg develops into a new one without fertilization. So, there is zero contribution by the opposite sex, that is the male, because there is no involvement of the sperm. Is that clear? So this is the meaning of parthenogenesis, a process where fertilization does not take place, syngamy does not take place. Okay? Where does syngamy occur? Now, what is syngamy? You all are aware, the fusion of the male and the female gamete. Yes? Now, where does it happen? Based on where it happens, based on the site of occurrence, where does the fusion happen, where does the fertilization happen, we can classify syngamy into external fertilization and internal fertilization. Is this clear to all of you? So here we are classifying the process of fertilization, we are classifying the process of syngamy based on where it occurs, based on the site of occurrence. Now we will see what is the meaning of external fertilization and internal fertilization. Now, in the form of a table, in the form of a comparative table, you can see here the definition and the differences between external fertilization and internal fertilization. Okay, so external, as the name itself indicates, it happens outside the parent body. Fertilization does not happen inside the parent, outside it happens. Internal, as the name itself indicates, it happens inside the parent body. Isn't it very simple? So external fertilization means the syngamy or fertilization occurs in the external medium, mostly in an aquatic medium, that is water. Okay, it happens, that is the sperm and the egg fuse together. So this is the sperm, this is the egg, and this is the sperm. Now where do they meet each other? They fuse and they meet and fuse with each other, not inside the parent body but outside the parent body in an external medium. Now, what about the corresponding point under internal fertilization? Fertilization occurs inside the body of the female organism. Now, this female organism is obviously the parent. So it doesn't happen inside the male parent. Please remember, it happens inside the female parent. That's why it is called internal. Okay, so the first difference is external fertilization happens in the external medium, not inside the parent body but outside the parent body, and internal fertilization happens inside the female parent. Okay, then what is the one important disadvantage of external fertilization? See, obviously, fertilization happened outside, zygote is formed outside, the young one is also formed outside. So, the young one or the offsprings that are produced are vulnerable to predators. There are a lot of predators and there are a lot of harmful factors in the outside environment, isn't it? So, the offspring, the young ones that are produced by external fertilization are very, very vulnerable to predators, and they may face this threat from the predators up to the time they become adults. So this is the disadvantage. So many young ones may end up dying because they fall prey to the predators. Did you understand? So in external fertilization, the offsprings are vulnerable to predators. But why in internal fertilization this disadvantage is not there? Because we saw that the fertilization happens inside the female organism, and so mostly in most of the internal fertilization cases what happens is the offspring is well protected and cared for within the parent body. So I use the word in most of the organisms that use internal fertilization, not all. You will see much later why I said in most. But for now, remember, in most organisms which exhibit internal fertilization, the zygote and the embryo develops inside the parent body, and so they are well protected and well cared for as opposed to external fertilization. Okay, another important feature of external fertilization is both the male and the female will produce a large number of gametes. So very important, the male will produce a huge number of sperm and the female will produce a huge number of egg. Can you tell me why? To increase the chances of syngamy, to improve the chances of fertilization, isn't it? So in case of external fertilization, the male and the female both produce enormous number of gametes. However, it is seen that in internal fertilization there are more number of male gametes, but there is a significant reduction in the number of female gamete or the eggs that are produced. Okay, so remember this thing, in external fertilization there is more number of both male and female gametes. In internal fertilization there is only increase in the number of male gametes and there is a significant reduction in the number of female gametes. In which organism do we see external fertilization? We see that in algae, these are the lower plants, and then you have fishes, which are lower vertebrates, as well as amphibians. In all these cases, the male and the female gametes are released synchronously into the external medium where fertilization takes place. And then we see internal fertilization in case of plants such as bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, angiosperms, and we also see them in fungi, and we see them in higher vertebrates like reptiles, birds, and mammals. Okay? This table is very important. This table is a very important 3-mark question. Differentiate between external and internal fertilization along with appropriate or suitable examples. So it is very important you go through this table, you understand what is being taught over here. Okay. Now, just to give you a perspective, a detail, we have dealt with external and internal fertilization in detail. You can see how the male and the female frogs are mating here in the aqueous medium and how the eggs and the sperm are both liberated outside the parent body. This is the outside medium, which is the aqueous medium, the water, isn't it? Now that's why frogs need to go to water for reproduction. They need water to breed. So in external fertilization, like we discussed, but the gametes, the male and the female gametes, are synchronously liberated into the outside medium, and fertilization takes place in the external medium. And what else did I tell you? There is release of large amounts of gametes by both the male and the female to enhance the chances of syngamy. We also saw that the major disadvantage being, since the embryo is formed outside the body, there are chances that they may fall prey to predators. So the developing young ones are extremely vulnerable to predators that threaten their survival up to adulthood. Internal fertilization. Where did the syngamy happen? The syngamy happens inside the body of the female parent. Okay, the best example is higher vertebrates, including mammals. Yes or no? Now see, in mammals they have shown the diagram here of how the sperm are being liberated into the female reproductive tract, and then the egg is located in the ampulla of the fallopian tube. We have learnt in human reproduction. So here you can see the egg gets surrounded by the sperm, and one of them successfully fuse with the egg to result in the formation of a diploid egg. Sorry, a diploid zygote. Then can you see how enormous the number of sperm are? So here you can see lots of sperm are liberated into the female reproductive tract, whereas only one egg is liberated a month by the human female. So you can consider humans as a suitable example to explain the concept of internal fertilization. So both the gametes are not massive in number. It is only the sperm. The male gametes are produced in large numbers. There is a significant reduction in the female gametes. So this is seen in case of fungi, in lower plants like bryophytes and pteridophytes, in seed plants like gymnosperms and angiosperms, in higher vertebrates like reptiles, birds, and the most advanced vertebrates, that is mammals. Now we have discussed about syngamy in animals, isn't it? So external fertilization, internal fertilization. Now can you recall and tell me on what basis was syngamy classified into external and internal? Yes, on the basis of where it happens. If it happens outside, it is external fertilization. If it happens inside the parent or the female body, then it is internal fertilization. Okay, so now moving on to how exactly syngamy takes place in plants. In some of the lower plants, like in case of bryophytes and pteridophytes, and in the first seed plants, that is gymnosperms, it is seen that the male gamete is motile. So mostly the egg is formed and it is retained inside the female. So the egg does not travel. The egg does not move anywhere, because in all the cases the egg is immotile or non-motile. They cannot move. Did you understand? So basically you have to say that the eggs are not being transported anywhere. The female just keeps the egg within her. It is the male gamete that is motile and that reaches the egg. So this is seen in lower plants and the earliest seed plants like gymnosperms. Okay, so remember, it is the male gamete who mostly has to make that journey towards the female gamete, because the male gamete is motile and the female gamete is non-motile in this particular case. What about in seed plants, like in case of flowering plants? If you take flowering plants, and this kind of a mechanism is also seen in the earliest seed plants, in spite of the male gametes being motile, which have cilia on them. However, if you talk about the most advanced plants, that is, now here in this example we are talking about the angiosperms, which are not only the seed plants but which are also the flowering plants. So if you were to take into account the seed plants which bear flowers, which have fruit, which bear fruit, they are called angiosperms. In them, the male gamete is non-motile. Then how can such a male gamete, here also the egg is retained within the female, the egg doesn't make any journey here. Then who transfers the male gamete all the way to the egg? It is obviously by the pollen tube. We had discussed in the last lecture that inside the ovary there is a structure called ovule, isn't it? Inside the ovule, the egg is sitting here. The egg doesn't go anywhere, and this is the ovary, the wall of the ovary, isn't it? See, this is the ovary, and this is the ovule, and this is the egg which is inside the ovule. Then how does the male gamete reach all the way? We had seen that a tube emerges from the pollen grain, and the tube enters the ovule and discharges the paired male gametes inside the ovule, isn't it? Now what is this tube? What did we call it? We called it as the pollen tube. So in higher plants, in angiosperms and flowering plants, of course, pollen tube is also seen in gymnosperms. But here we are learning with reference to angiosperms. So in them, the male gametes are non-motile and they are transferred into the closer to the female gamete sitting inside the ovule via a pollen tube. Okay. See here in this picture you can see how the pollen grains are being deposited onto this platform called the stigma, and see these yellow colored tubes which are emerging down, and these are the pollen tubes, and see one of the pollen tube has gone all the way down and it has pierced into the ovule and it has now discharged its male gametes into the closer to the egg. Okay. Events in sexual reproduction that occur after fertilization. So now we had, until now we discussed about fertilization. So I hope the concept of fertilization or syngamy is clear to all of you. So now we need to discuss about post-fertilization events. Post means what happens after fertilization. Obviously by now you know there is formation of a diploid cell which is referred to as the zygote. Is that all? No. The zygote is a single cell. So the zygote has to transform itself into a multicellular structure which is referred to as the embryo. So basically the process of post-fertilization events include two major steps. First one is formation of zygote, which is a byproduct of fertilization, and then because the zygote is a single cell, it has to develop into a multicellular embryo, and this process is referred to as embryogenesis. Is this clear to all of you? So two major events which come under post-fertilization are formation of zygote and embryogenesis. Okay, so now let us look into the first important step or first important event of post-fertilization, which is called the formation of zygote. Now, where is the zygote formed? In case of external fertilization, we saw in external fertilization, the fusion of the egg and the sperm happened outside the body. So obviously the zygote is also formed in the external environment or the external medium. Whereas in internal fertilization, we saw that the fusion happens inside the body of the female parent. So obviously the zygote is formed inside the body of the female parent. So it's important to note that where exactly the zygote is formed. So the site of formation of zygote. So there is two sites. One is in case of external fertilization, the site is external medium. In case of internal fertilization, the site is inside the body of the female parent. In fungi and algae, let us see the fate of the zygote. Now, once the zygote is formed, what happens to the zygote? Fate of the zygote. Does it immediately develop into an embryo? No, that's what we are going to deal with here. If you talk about fungi and lower plants such as algae, the zygote will not immediately develop into an embryo. It will still be a single cell itself. This zygote will now start producing a thick wall around itself. Now remember all of you that the zygote is just a one single cell. It's a one cell structure, isn't it? So in fungi and algae, the zygote will develop a thick wall around itself to protect itself from desiccation or dehydration and damage from any kind of an external agency. Okay, and now what it does after producing a thick wall around itself, it will enter into a period of rest. So probably it is meant to overcome the unfavorable conditions, because all of you remember one thing: in most organisms sexual reproduction happens during unfavorable conditions, asexual reproduction happens during favorable conditions. Okay, so why should the zygote do this? To overcome the unfavorable condition, it goes through a period of rest. After that, the zygote will undergo germination into a young one. So where is this phenomenon observed, where the zygote develops a thick wall around itself? It is seen in the case of fungi and algae. You can see a picture over here of how on a filament of an algae you can see how nicely a zygote is formed. It has two sets of chromosomes, so let me write 2n. And can you see this thick translucent wall that has developed around it? Now this is referred to as the spore wall, and such a zygote which has entered into a state of rest is sometimes referred to as a zygospore, because it is now resting, it is tiding over the unfavorable condition, and it can overcome, it can resist dehydration or desiccation, and it can resist damage from any kind of an external danger or an external agency. So in which organisms do you see the formation of a spore wall or a thick wall around the zygote immediately after its formation? It is seen in fungi and algae. Okay, so that was one fate of zygote. In some other cases, what happens is the second fate of zygote is, if this is the zygote which is diploid, the zygote will not immediately give rise to the embryo. The zygote will soon participate in meiosis. See how surprising it is that the zygote is undergoing meiosis. Why should the zygote undergo meiosis? So that it can give rise to haploid cells. Now such haploid cells that are formed are referred to as the meiospores, because they are products of what? Because they are products of meiosis, and each of these meiospores will develop into a young individual or a young organism. So basically, you can think and tell me, are the young ones haploid or diploid? The young ones are now haploid. They grow to become adults also, which have only one set of chromosome in their cells. So the young ones here are haploid. How did the young ones become haploid? Because the zygote underwent meiosis. And what do we call such organisms which are haploid for the major part of their lives? We say that they exhibit a special type of life cycle which is called the haplontic life cycle. This haplontic life cycle is very common in algal forms and even fungal forms, okay, where for the much of their life they are haploid. Only the zygote represents, so I'm writing here, in their lives zygote represents the only diploid phase. And this is obviously, zygote won't last forever, it will soon undergo meiosis, so it is a temporary diploid phase. So remember, in these organisms which exhibit a haploid life cycle, they have a temporary diploid phase, and this temporary diploid phase is represented by the zygote. And how does the zygote cease to be diploid? Because the zygote will soon take part in meiosis to produce haploid spores called meiospores, and each of them germinate into a young one which grow to become a mature organism. Clear? So what are the two fates of zygote that we learned in this particular case? This is mostly with regard to plants. Okay, there is no zygotic meiosis in animals. Okay, so what are the two fates? Let me write it here for you. The two fates of zygote are, the first fate that we learned, that it develops a thick wall around itself. And once it develops a thick wall, it goes through a period of rest. Then the second important fate that we saw was, it will soon undergo zygotic meiosis. And the zygotic meiosis, the ultimate goal is the formation of haploid young ones. Okay, so two major fates of zygote when it comes to lower plants such as algae and fungi. All right. Okay, now post-fertilization events, we are continuing with that. We are still talking about the zygote, please remember. We just finished discussing the fate of the zygote. Now, why the zygote is such an important phase in the life of an organism is it forms a vital link. If they ask you the significance of zygote for a 1 mark, very unlikely, but they may ask such questions also. So, zygote is a vital link between one generation of organisms and the next. Isn't the zygote responsible for ensuring the continuity of species? It ensures that the species continue to exist by producing more and more offsprings. So zygote can be considered as an essential link or a vital link between organisms of one generation and the next. And the second point is very important and very fascinating indeed, that every sexually reproducing organism, and even us complex, so-called complex beings, now you can imagine how complex your body is. We have so many tissues in our body, we have so many organs in our body, and understanding the human body and its physiology is such a complicated task. But how did we all begin our life? We began our life as a single cell within our mother's body, and this single cell was a zygote. So remember that every sexually reproducing organism, including human beings, begin their life as a single cell that is referred to as a zygote. So it is hard to imagine that we were once upon a time a tiny little cell sitting inside the fallopian tubes of our mothers, isn't it? Okay. Now, the second important step under post-fertilization events is referred to as embryogenesis. We are done with formation of zygote. Now the zygote has to develop into an embryo because the zygote is a single cell. But most of the organisms in higher groups of organisms, they are all multicellular. If a zygote has to develop into a multicellular embryo, it has to undergo a process that is referred to as embryogenesis. So what is embryogenesis? 1 mark question. Development of embryo from the zygote. And the two major processes, please highlight and write this down. The two major processes involved in embryogenesis, or the two major steps in embryogenesis, are: first one, cell division. Obviously the zygote has to undergo. Do you remember in human reproduction we had learnt that the zygote divides repeatedly through cell division, that is called cleavage, isn't it? So the first step of embryogenesis is the zygote has to divide repeatedly by mitosis. And then what should happen next? The second important step in embryogenesis is differentiation. What do you mean by differentiation? Differentiation means cells which are formed by cell division, they are assigned with specific tasks. They become specific tissues and they become specific organs in order to give rise to a fully functional, a whole organism. Clear? It is not just enough if the zygote divides and forms a lump of cells. A lump of cells cannot become a human body, isn't it? For example, we have to have cells that become our bones, that become our neurons, that become our muscles. So what happens in that lump of cells? Each cell has a fate of its own. It develops into a particular tissue, a particular organ, so that we can become a functional organism, and this process is referred to as differentiation. So very important 2 mark question they may ask you. The 2 mark question is: name the two major steps or the two major processes which are involved in embryogenesis. All right. Now here, just to give you an idea of how a fertilized egg in a plant. Now this is a dicotyledon, so it's a flowering plant. So embryogenesis, the picture shows us about the development in a flowering plant, and see how the number of cells are increasing, isn't it? and see how the embryo is taking shape. The taking shape part and the development of different structure part is because of differentiation. And why is the size of the embryo increasing? The number of cells are increasing. That is because of cell division. So two important processes which are in action over here. One is the increase in number of cells, that is called cell division, and one is the cells become specialized, that is called cell differentiation. And this is embryogenesis in animals. See how this is probably this tiny dot here represents the zygote. Let us take it as a zygote for our understanding, and how it develops into a fetus, isn't it? Now this is a product of what? It's a byproduct of both what? Cell division and cell differentiation. So it is a byproduct of embryogenesis. So this is an example for embryogenesis that is happening in animals. Now, since we are talking about the development of the zygote, which involves embryogenesis, that is the formation of zygote and cell division and differentiation, based on where the zygote undergoes development. We keep saying now that zygote becomes an embryo, zygote becomes an embryo. The question is, where does it become an embryo? Based on that, we can classify organisms into oviparous organisms and viviparous or viviparous organisms. So please remember, on what basis have we classified it into oviparous and viviparous? It is on the basis of where the zygote develops into the embryo. Now let us talk about the first class of organisms, which is referred to as oviparous. As you can see how eggs are laid in these organisms, isn't it? So we say that the oviparous organisms lay eggs, but the eggs may be fertilized or may not be fertilized. But if you take higher organisms like reptiles and birds, in such cases these animals lay fertile eggs. Now, where does the zygote develop? The zygote develops outside the body. Why? Because the female has laid eggs. Once the egg is laid, the egg makes its way out of the female body. So, where does the zygote develop into an embryo? Outside the body of the female parent or the organism. Very, very, very important. Okay, so the zygote develops into a young one outside the body of the female organism. Why? Because the female organism is laying an egg. The egg may contain the unfertilized egg itself, or it may contain a zygote if it's fertilized. But what is the thing you should remember here? The zygote or the egg, let us consider fertilized egg in this case, the zygote is coming out of the parent body, and the development of the zygote into the young one, into the embryo, happens outside the female parent, outside the female organism. Did you understand? This happens in fishes and amphibians and in higher vertebrates like reptiles and birds. Is it clear? So oviparous and viviparous classification is based on where the zygote develops into the embryo. What about viviparous organisms? Now in viviparous organisms, the zygote is not given out of the female parent. The zygote develops into a young one inside the body of the female parent or the female organism. Please remember, you can take mammals for example, you can take humans for example. Where is the zygote formed in humans? Can anyone recall and think and just answer it yourself? Yes, it is formed inside the fallopian tube. Does the mother give out the zygote? No, the zygote is retained inside, and the zygote develops into an embryo inside the mother's body. And then what happens? This zygote is retained in the female parent. Correct? And now the zygote develops into an embryo again inside the female body itself. I'm so sorry. So I was telling you that zygote in the female parent develops into embryo which is also inside, and then the embryo grows to a certain stage. It becomes a young one, a certain stage of development, let me write here, and then they are delivered live from the female parent's body, isn't it? So in humans, you know that the embryo develops into a fetus. The fetus represents a certain stage. By the end of the 9th month of development, which is a certain stage, what happens to the fully formed fetus? It is delivered. That's why it is said that we give birth to live young ones. Do you understand? So animals, organisms in whom zygote develops into an embryo within the body of the female parent, and then the embryo grows up to a certain stage to give rise to young ones, and later the young ones are delivered out of the mother's body. Such organisms or such animals are referred to as viviparous. In oviparous, the zygote was released out of the female parent in the form of egg. The female lays eggs which contain zygote in them. And where does the zygote develop into an embryo? Outside the female parent or organism. Here it is inside the body of the female parent or organism. Is that clear? So oviparous and viviparous. Example for viviparous is most of the mammals. Of course, you know there are certain exceptions to this, but most of the mammals exhibit viviparity. So on what basis was it classified? On the basis of where the development of zygote takes place into the embryo. So again, you can expect this as a 2-marker question. The differences between oviparous and viviparous will be a 2-mark question. You have to define. First, you have to say they are classified based on the site of zygote developing into the embryo. If the development happens inside the female organism, it's called viviparous. If the development happens outside the female organism, it is called oviparous. Viviparous are those which deliver the live young ones, and oviparous are those which lay eggs. Okay. Now, like I had told you, oviparous animals can also lay unfertilized eggs because some of them exhibit external fertilization. Which are the animals which lay unfertilized eggs? Fishes, frogs, amphibians. And where does the fertilization happen? We saw external fertilization, when the fusion of gametes happens in the external medium, isn't it? And there are oviparous animals which produce fertilized eggs, like for example reptiles and birds. In oviparous animals like reptiles and birds, already fertilized egg, meaning it contains what in it? Zygote, is released outside the female parent. It is not released as such. It is covered by a hard calcareous shell. Why should it be covered with a hard calcareous shell? So that it is protected from external dangers, external environmental condition. And also it is protected from mechanical injury, isn't it? And this is laid in a safe place in the environment. So all of you must understand two things when we talk about egg laying animals. Either they lay unfertilized egg which is not yet become the zygote because it is yet to be fertilized, or they lay fertilized eggs which contain zygote in them. Which are the animals, for example, which lay fertilized eggs? Reptiles and birds. What are their eggs covered with? Their eggs are covered with calcareous shell because the zygote is developing outside the body of the parent or body of the female organism. It needs protection from mechanical injury, and as a result, it is covered with calcareous shell, porous calcareous shell, so that it can also take up oxygen from the surrounding environment. And it is laid in a safe environment which is protected from predators. Okay? Now a very important give reason question. Please mark this as a very important give reason question. In viviparous organisms, why is there a higher chances of survival of the young ones? Why the survival of the young ones is greater in viviparous organisms? First of all, remember, in viviparous organism, where is the zygote developing? The zygote develops into an embryo inside the female parent. So obviously the zygote is protected, the embryo is protected, the young one is protected and given proper care and protection. Obviously, if the zygote, the embryo and the young one up to a certain stage are retained within the mother's body, are developing within the body of the female parent, then there is no danger of external environment, there is no danger of predation. As a result, in viviparous organisms, the young ones which develop inside the mother's body have greater chances of survival. So remember, it is always the zygote. The zygote becomes embryo. The embryo becomes young one. Now when I say young one, up to a certain stage. Now in viviparous organisms, all these are happening inside the female parent body or organism, isn't it? So obviously when all these critical stages in the life of an organism, all these stages, the transition, when it is happening inside, there is no danger, there is lot of care and protection. As a result, the chances of survival are greater. Did you understand? So this is a very important give reason question. Okay. Embryogenesis in plants. Now in plants, you know that mostly if you take a flowering plant, for example, we had discussed in the previous lecture also, there is stigma, there is style, and there is a swollen part of the carpel or the pistil which is called the ovary, and then you have the male part which is the anther, and then you have the petal, and then you have the sepal. All these are the accessory parts. Now what they're saying here is after fertilization, post fertilization, all these accessory parts will get shed off. They will be shed off. They are not required anymore. Okay, then what is sitting inside this carpel? Do you remember we had said that inside the carpel there is the ovule, and inside the ovule now after fertilization there is zygote. So remember, this is the ovary, the swollen part, and this is the ovule, and sitting inside the ovule is the zygote. So let me draw it here again. The stigma, the style, and the ovary, and inside the ovary, ovule and zygote, isn't it? So I'm only highlighting the things which I need for explanation now. Ovary, ovule, zygote. Now this is what happens after fertilization. I told you that all the accessory parts like petals and sepals get shed off, isn't it? Now we are left with only the crucial, the critical part which has the ovule sitting inside it, isn't it? And with a zygote inside, a product of fertilization. Now what happens after this? After fertilization is successful, the ovary develops into a thick wall which is called the pericarp. So the ovary becomes thicker and thicker, and this pericarp is nothing but what we consume as the fruit wall. So the ovary becomes the fruit. Now what happens to the ovule after fertilization? It becomes the seed, and the zygote obviously will become a multicellular embryo. So embryo within the seed, seed within the pericarp. So this is the fate of the structures which are involved in, we are specifically talking here about flowering plants, isn't it? Angiosperms is what my focus here is all about. So you know now the structures. What become what after fertilization? Ovary becomes the fruit wall, which is called a very thick fruit wall called pericarp. Ovule becomes seed, and inside this ovule there was a zygote which was one cell. Now it has become a many-celled embryo. So embryo inside the seed, seed inside the pericarp. Did you understand what I'm saying? So it's important to know these structures. Zygote to embryo, ovule to seed, wall of the ovary to wall of the fruit, which is called the pericarp. Okay, so this gives you an idea about embryogenesis happening in advanced, that is flowering plants or angiosperms. Now here they have given section of some of the fruits showing the seed and the pericarp. What was the seed before fertilization? Before fertilization it was ovule. What did it have inside? It had egg. Now after fertilization it is a seed with what inside? It has a zygote which has developed into an embryo, isn't it? Okay. What was the pericarp before fertilization? It was the ovary. Now it has become a fruit wall that is called pericarp. So in this is the pea plant, this is the seed which came from the ovule, and this is the pericarp which came from the wall of the ovary. Once again here, this is the ovule that became the seed, wall of the ovary that became a fleshy pericarp. Here also you have ovule and wall of the ovary. So what becomes the seed after fertilization? Ovule. Pericarp comes from the wall of the ovary. So seed and pericarp. So S stands for seed and P stands for pericarp. Remember, we are yet here, we are talking about post fertilization. What becomes what after fertilization in case of flowering plants? So that completes the chapter of reproduction in organisms. Now in today's lecture specifically, what did we learn? We learnt about the major and the critical and the vital event of sexual reproduction, that is fertilization or syngamy. We saw that there is a kind of reproduction, a sexual reproduction. There is a debate as to whether to consider it as sexual or asexual, but it involves the female gamete which escapes fertilization. So without fertilization, the female gamete develops into a new organism, into a young one, that is parthenogenesis. Then we saw where fertilization happens. On that basis, we have classified it into external and internal fertilization. Then we saw how syngamy happens in plants with motile gametes and how it happens in seed plants with the help of, especially in angiosperms where the gametes are non-motile, how the pollen tube brings the non-motile gametes to the egg. Then we saw post-fertilization event, formation of zygote, and the zygote starts dividing and differentiating to develop into an embryo. Then we saw depending on where the zygote develops, whether the zygote develops outside the female organism or it develops inside the female organism. We saw egg laying or oviparous and those which deliver the young ones live, which are called viviparous. Then we saw in the end the embryogenesis with respect to flowering plants. What becomes what? The seed, the ovule becomes the seed which contains a developing embryo, and the wall of the ovary becomes the wall of the fruit which is called the pericarp. Now moving on to homework. In today's homework we have some extra questions as well. This is the page 1. There is a next page also. Okay, so please note. So in today's homework we have define parthenogenesis, giving an example, differentiate between external and internal fertilization, define syngamy, state the major disadvantage of external fertilization, name the two processes involved in embryogenesis, differentiate between oviparous and viviparous animals, Chances of survival of young ones in viviparous is greater. Give reason. And the last two questions I have not assigned marks for them because it is more of an activity like of a question, like an assignment where you have to look for an answer. Okay, so it's not to assign marks, but just so that you are thorough with this, for so that you get a deeper understanding into the subject. This was regarding the first lecture, that is where I dealt with the lifespans. You have to find out the lifespan of elephant, of rose plant, of dog, banana tree, cow, horse, fruit fly, rice plant, and banyan tree. You also have to find out what is a meiocyte. Go back to the previous lecture. You have written this in your homework also. A cell which is diploid, which undergoes meiosis to produce gametes or sex cells, is called meiocyte. So I want you to find out the diploid number of meiocytes in these animals, that is rat, cat, and a fern which is called Ophioglossum, then rice plant, potato plant, and onion plant. Okay, so with this we complete this lecture as well as the chapter of reproduction in organisms. So until next time, take care all of you, and all the very best. Thank you.